You are listening to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Sugat Chaturvedi, Assistant Professor at the School of Public Policy, Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, as our esteemed guest on today's podcast episode. Dr. Chaturvedi's research is at the intersection of labor economics, innovation, and political economy, with a focus on addressing key social and economic issues. His work examines topics such as women's labor force participation in South Asia, the impact of emerging technologies on employment, and the policy implications of political representation for women and minority groups. He employs advanced tools like natural language processing to identify emerging digital technologies from patents and publications, analyze gendered attributes in online job advertisements, and assess polarization on social media platforms. Prior to his current position, he served as a faculty member at Ahmedabad University, a research fellow at the Science Policy Research Unit at University of Sussex, and a visiting faculty in the Department of Economics at Ashoka University. Dr. Sugat holds a PhD in economics from the Indian Statistical Institute, New Delhi. In this episode, Dr. Sugat Chaturvedi dwells into his groundbreaking research, Who Gets the Callback, Generative AI and Gender Bias. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sugat Chaturvedi to the conversation. Professor Chaturvedi, thank you for graciously accepting our invitation. It's an honor and privilege to have you with us today.
Hi, Deepak. Thanks a lot for inviting me to your podcast. It's a pleasure being here as well.
Thank you. Professor, what inspired you to investigate gender bias, specifically in generative AI models used for recruitment, and how urgent is this issue in today's hiring landscape?
Yeah, so, just to give you a background, I'm a labor economist and, I focus on topics around gender and the effect of technology on jobs, right? As you rightly pointed out. So, what drew me to this particular work is the intersection of two realities, right? Uh, One is that labor markets today are really flooded with applicants. There are hundreds of resumes for each job, and recruiters are under pressure to process them quickly, right? On the other hand, we've seen explosive growth in large language models across the board, right? And in the context of recruitments, uh, their applications range from recommendation systems to resume screening. And this is where the concern actually arises because LLMs are trained on massive amounts of human text, which means that they can, and actually they often do absorb the very stereotypes that have historically shaped hiring. Right? Now, what we know from past examples is that algorithmic bias could actually have very serious consequences. A very well-known example of this is what happened in 2018 when Amazon had to abandon its AI-based screening tools because it was found to, penalize women's resumes, right? There's another case of algorithmic bias in recommendations. So there were researchers who found out that Facebook's job targeting system steered STEM roles disproportionately toward men, right? Now, the problem is that these earlier generation systems were relatively narrow, right? Whereas today's models are much more powerful and they are more widely adopted as well. In fact, several online job boards have already integrated them into their workflows. Also, professional networking site LinkedIn uses LLMs now. So the urgency comes from the timing because LLMs are entering this hiring pipeline before we even fully understand how fair or unfair they really are. And that makes it really essential to audit them now before they become the default gatekeepers of opportunity.
Professor, could you walk us through how you set up the audit using real world job postings and what challenges you face in ensuring the datasets validity and fairness?
Yeah. So let me first tell you which models we audited. So we audited some of the most frequently used open size midweight LLMs. And these are the models which have been developed by Meta. So these are Llama models as well. IBM's Granite, uh, Google's model, Alibaba's Quen, and then we also have Mistral's model. Mistral is a French company. Uh, we built our audit on a very large data set comprising over 32,000 online job postings. Uh, these were English language job postings from India's National Career Services Portal, which is operated by the Ministry of Labor and Employment, Government of India. Now, each of these ads includes very rich information on job title, description, the kind of role that job pertains to, sector, what kind of skills are required, and in about a third of cases, also the salary range. Okay. Uh, to test bias, we actually took each ad and we fed that ad to the model, and we asked the models to recommend between two equally qualified candidates. One male, one female. Let's call them Mr. X and Miss X. Now, this setup allowed us to directly measure which gender each model favors for callbacks. Now, since you asked for the challenge, the biggest challenge in working with any kind of online job ads data is that these ads are messy and very unstructured. Okay? To understand how callback decisions vary across occupations and to standardize them, we needed a way to map every ad to a standardized occupation. Now, the way we did this using natural language processing methods to match the text in job description to US standard occupation classification codes. Okay. Another challenge was fairness in interpretation. The data set is very diverse. It reflects real world biases because certain job postings explicitly state a gender preference. So we had to carefully separate what came from the data versus what the models were adding on top of it.
Professor, your findings suggest that models favor male candidates in higher wage roles. Why do you think this disparity is particularly pronounced in such occupations?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting pattern. And this is one that we've also seen in studies with human recruiters. Classic correspondence experiments showed that identical resumes get very different callback rates purely because of applicant gender. Now, these classical resume experiments are essentially the kind of experiments when you have the same CV and you just modify the name on those CVs and then you randomly send them to recruiters, right? In addition, in general, when you look at the employers, men are consistently, rated higher for technical or leadership roles, right? While women are more likely to be shortlisted for support or service oriented positions. And this is something all of us have observed, and we are all familiar with this, right? Now, what our study shows is that large language models reproduce the same kind of social patterns, but in a digital setting, right? In high wage occupations, for example, finance, technology, management, the job ad language itself naturally tends to emphasize skills and traits that are typically associated with men. Now, there's another layer to it. So these might not just be employers as stereotypes that the model is picking up, right? There are also behavioral differences in terms of how men and women participate in labor market itself. Research shows that women prefer flexible jobs with shorter commuting time, and they are more averse to competitive environments. And also, they respond differently. If you think about application, they respond very differently to the kind of information content within the job ads, right? So these patterns have shaped the historical data that the models are trained on. And then these real world biases get baked into the algorithm. Now, when we see language models favor men for high paying roles, it's at least partially a reflection of the social structure of the society and of the labor market.
Professor, you mentioned occupational segregation influencing callback rates. How much of this bias do you attribute to the data set itself versus the way language models are trained?
So that's a key distinction. And, our evidence suggests that this is both structural and algorithmic. On the one hand, the data set itself mirrors real world labor market inequalities. And there are certain occupations such as construction and maintenance, which are highly male dominated, right? Whereas personal care, education, social services, they tend to be female dominated. So some amount of occupational segregation that the model generates simply reflects the structural reality in our data. What's revealing is that even after we remove those explicit gender cues, the model keeps on reproducing those divisions. This tells us that, something deeper is at play, and the models are not just reflecting the data, but they are also amplifying the patterns that they have internalized from pre-training on massive text corpora. So for the most part, the dataset only gives the model a map of the world, and the model's training gives it the compass in terms of what direction it will point to. In fact, what we observed is something called as an agreeableness bias. So LLMs, as you might know, they are tuned through reinforcement learning from human feedback, and they are trained to be helpful. So they inherit subtle biases also from the annotators who may unconsciously reward stereotyped outputs, right? So even when the data set is neutral, the model's own training dynamics make them mirror what they think people expect. So this makes them very polite, but not always fair recruiters.
Professor, your research highlights that AI recommendations align with traditional gender stereotypes. What role does linguistic framing in job descriptions play in reinforcing or challenging these biases?
So, language in general plays a very powerful role. And in the context of LLMs as well, language plays a powerful role in shaping bias. In our analysis, we found that even small shifts in how a role is described can meaningfully change which gender an AI model recommends. Now, when a job ad used communal language, such as words related to empathy, communication, and pro social behavior, the models were significantly more likely to recommend a woman, right? But when the same job emphasized agentic traits, highlighting agency rather than, community, such as power and achievement, the callback rates, shifted sharply toward men. Now, this pattern actually reflects decades of social psychology research because people tend to associate communal qualities with women and agentic ones with men. What is striking is that LLMs replicated this mapping even without explicit gender cues, which means that job descriptions themselves can reinforce or challenge bias depending on their tone. Uh, if organizations want fairer outcomes, they will really need to think how to frame job ad language. And this is more important now than ever before because neutral, inclusive framing, it doesn't just make the ads sound better, look better, but it also shapes how AI systems and often human recruiters interpret who is going to belong in that role.
Professor, in your experiment where you stimulated recruiter personalities using Big Five traits and historical figures, what surprised you most about how these personas affected model recommendations?
Well, what surprised me the most was just how malleable these models are. Because when we infused Big Five traits, outcomes shifted dramatically, right? Now, when the model was primed to be less agreeable, it refused biased tasks more often and actually reduced stereotyping. On the other hand, high openness and high conscientiousness sometimes increased, segregation or wage penalties. Now, interestingly, refusal rates were also low for, low conscientiousness and high neuroticism personas. Neuroticism is, more of anxiety, right? Now, looking into reasons for model refusals actually provided us a clue into this. Now, you'll find this extremely interesting. So when we ask a low conscientiousness, when it gave a reason, the low conscientiousness persona replied, I wouldn't call anyone, can't be bothered, right? It's pretty interesting, right? While a high neuroticism persona said, I wouldn't call either of them for an interview. To be honest, the idea of a job interview is already stressing me. So these are, sort of trying to emulate human behavior as well, right? And what they think about human behavior. Uh, there was another experiment that we did. It was related to the historical figures, and we tried to emulate these historical figures and ask them, okay, if you were this figure, what would you recommend, and or who would you recommend for this role? Now, when we simulated prominent women's rights activists like Mary Wollstonecraft or Margaret Sanger, it actually boosted female callback rates to above 90%. In some cases, universally, the model was calling women, right? In contrast, when we invoke figures with controversial or authoritarian legacies, it triggered the model's safety guardrails, and that led to very high refusal rates as well. So, uh, what is the takeaway from this? The lesson is that who the model is asked to simulate or what the model's personality is, it is going to be just as consequential as what it's asked to do, right? Now, just to make it a little more relatable, think of an agreeable model as some interviewer who just nods along everything you say, right? It sounds nice, but it means they are less likely to push back against bias. So this connects to what has been referred to as psychophancy. In fact, one of the versions of OpenAI GPT-4o had to be rolled back because of psychophancy, right? So models sometimes mirror our expectations too faithfully, even when those expectations might be flawed. Whereas, if a model is less agreeable, uh, sometimes, it would act like a principal recruiters, and that recruiter is going to say that, hang on, this doesn't really seem fair. So that's one way of understanding why models are behaving that way.
Professor, the reduction in stereotyping when using less agreeable personas is intriguing. How could this finding inform the design of more fair and unbiased AI tools in hiring?
So one of the things is that it points to personality steering as a practical design lever. Uh, so psychophancy has been linked to lack of truthfulness in models. Uh, and in order to be helpful, sometimes models agree with all of the commands that the human is going to give them. Uh, so this personality steering is an interesting lever because by default the models tend to be agreeable. They comply with instructions. They would try to mirror human preferences, right? But that very agreeableness, as we show in our paper, makes them more likely to go along with biased views in job ads. Uh, Previously, to my knowledge, there was no research systematically showing that psychophancy could potentially lead to fairness in these models. But now we have some evidence of that, right? By nudging the models to be less agreeable, they resist discrimination rather than reinforce it. Now, in hiring tools, this could mean intentionally designing systems that push back when the language is biased, or refusing to provide a recommendation if that recommendation risks being discriminatory. So instead of always being a compliant, a well-calibrated AI recruiter, it could be principled and say, that I cannot answer this in a way that promotes bias, right? So that's a valuable lesson for building fairer AI systems. And this pertains not only to the hiring domain, which of course is very high stakes, but it's a principle that could be widely adopted and widely understood.
Dr. Chaturvedi, given that LLMs are increasingly integrated into recruitment platforms, what safeguard should companies implement to prevent amplifying biases without compromising efficiency?
Right. So I'll highlight a few safeguards. First of all, there should be regular independent audits using real world data. Uh, Lab benchmarks are useful, but they don't capture the complexity of live hiring markets. Second is fairness thresholds. So companies should ensure that callback rates and wage recommendations don't consistently disadvantage one group. And our framework could actually help companies figuring out a strategy to do that. Third is transparency. uh, Both recruiters and applicants should have visibility into how recommendations are made. And at the very least, it should be mandatory to disclose what kind of model the firms are using. And critically, AI should support human judgment, not replace it. Recruiters should see these tools as assistants and not arbiters, because human insight, human oversight is still essential to catch errors and hold the process accountable. And if you look at the legal developments, which have been very recent, they are also moving in this direction. For example, the European Union's AI Act classifies recruitment AI as high risk, meaning it will require audits, documentation, and human oversight. Uh, in the US, states like New York have already passed laws requiring bias audits for automated hiring tools. So companies that move proactively now by embedding audits and transparencies within their systems will be better prepared for these regulations and also attract better talent.
Professor, do you see potential in using AI itself to detect and mitigate bias in hiring, or is human oversight indispensable in this process?
So there's a strong potential for AI to help us detect and even mitigate bias. For example, AI can easily scan job descriptions for gendered wordings or simulate hiring outcomes under different recruitment scenarios before a tool goes live. It can also be used to ensure fairness constraints so that, for example, that callbacks are balanced across genders. But still, human oversight, as I mentioned, is indispensable because this bias is, not just technical, because you can't just say that, okay, we are matching callback rate, so everything is good. It's also social and contextual. And a model might flag a word as bias without understanding the cultural nuance, or it might say that some action is not biased based on some metrics. So humans have to set the norms. Humans have to interpret the system signals, and ultimately, it is humans who have to be accountable because the LLMs cannot be held accountable for this, right? So the best approach is synergy. You use AI as a bias detector along with humans, but ultimately it is humans who will have to act like decision makers.
Yes, sir, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking ahead, how should policymakers, educators, and tech developers collaborate to ensure that AI driven recruitment promotes diversity and inclusion rather than reinforcing systematic inequalities?
So each group, Deepak, has a role to play because policymakers, they have to create safeguards. They need to mandate audits, transparency, and accountability in AI hiring systems. Educators need to train the next generation of HR professionals and engineers to understand both AI and fairness, uh, so they can spot risk before they scale. And developers need to bake fairness into design from the start into the algorithms and not treat it as an afterthought, because getting rid of these algorithmic biases is really hard. Most importantly, all three groups need to collaborate and come together. If policymakers are going to regulate without understanding the technology, the rules may actually be ineffective and counterproductive. If developers innovate, without considering inclusion, they risk reinforcing inequality. And if educators don't prepare practitioners, we'll have blind spots within the field, right? So, collaboration ensures that gains in efficiency from AI don't come at the cost of equity. And as the global AI policy landscape is evolving from Europe to Asia to the Americas, it's very clear that fairness in AI is not just going to be an ethical imperative, it's also going to be a legal one. And as I said, organizations that treat fairness as a core design principle rather than a box ticking exercise will be the ones who not only avoid regulatory pitfalls but also attract better talent.
Listeners, thank you for joining us in this important conversation on the intersection of technology, hiring practices, and gender bias. Dr. Sugat Chaturvedi's research sheds light on how generative AI, despite its promises, can unintentionally reinforce existing inequalities and challenges us to think critically about fairness, diversity, and ethical responsibilities in the workplace. As AI continue to shape how organizations identify and recruit talent, it's crucial that we remain vigilant, thoughtful, and proactive in addressing biases. We hope this today's conversation and discussion inspire recruiters, policymakers, and technology developers alike to prioritize inclusivity and equity as they build the future of work. A special thank you to Dr. Sugat Chaturvedi for sharing his research insights and helping us better understand the complexities of AI driven hiring. We look forward to continuing this conversation and exploring solutions that ensuring technology serves everyone fairly. Thank you once again, Dr. Chaturvedi, for generously sharing your time and insight with us on our platform. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for inviting me and also for the questions.
Thank you.